We got Josh here from College Football Nerds breaking down the landscape of college football entering week 6. Join Josh there at collegefootballnerds.com. They do a phenomenal job breaking down the sport we all love. Is the Pac-12 as good as it may appear to be, winning 7 of 10 against the other 4 conferences in fairly like-seeded type matchups?
I mean, they certainly seem good. One of the tweets, you can look at our Twitter at CFB Nerds, and we put a tweet out this past week where I just went ahead and ran the model for the top 12 Pac-12 teams and the top 12 SEC teams. In our model, the Pac-12 goes 6-6. It favors the SEC in overall margin by 2.4 points, I believe. The top 4 Pac-12 teams beat the top 4 SEC teams. And then, you can do math the rest of the way. They're 2-8. The SEC is a lot deeper than the Pac-12, which I think people sometimes overlook. When you start looking like team to like team, especially by like the halfway mark, there's really not much comparison. The bottom of the Pac-12 isn't great. But Oregon is a genuinely very good team. Everything I've seen from Washington has been a very good team, though last week was a little concerning. And I will also say Penix Jr. is one of those guys that I like to say is consistently inconsistent. Everybody gets very high on him, and then he'll go 2 or 3 games where he doesn't produce very well. USC, they've got the offense to beat everybody and anybody, and they have the defense to lose to anybody and everybody. Every game's going to be a shootout, which is very dangerous because now it means variability, right? 2 or 3 turnovers has the potential to decide the game because you can have 12 yards per play, right? And if the other team's going to score 50-something points and you turn it over 3 times, you score 7 points a drive, no matter if you're going at 12 yards a play or if you're going 8, you get the same point value. And that's sort of the problem USC has. But overall, the conference is, I think, legitimately strong. I do wonder a little bit if we've drawn a few too many conclusions. The Colorado TCU game, hopefully at some point people are accepting the fact that TCU is just nothing like a normal returning champion. That is probably the worst returning championship game participant in the last maybe 20 years. They're just not very good. They're fine, maybe. Florida is not a great team. Our model still hates Florida and Utah. It has them in like the 80s. It just really thinks that Tennessee-Florida game was a weird fluke and maybe a matchup issue, which with Joe Milton, Tennessee's going to have a lot of weird fluke games where they're gonna beat somebody they shouldn't and they're going to lose to somebody they shouldn't. So when you start to break it down, I think it gets a little tougher. But I will say our model is all about relational data. It has them about even. And the other thing I'll say, the nature of college football, we're not going to get more out of conference games. So however teams move around in the ratings, they're only moving because of how they played against each other within their own conference. We're not going to get any other data points.
Exactly.
So you have to assume they're even. Like I've always believed, you can't just throw out the first few weeks of the season and Florida State beating LSU because, the teams have changed. Well, Florida State's going to change and LSU is going to change. They're both going to hopefully improve. So there's no way to disprove the notion that the Pac-12 is an even conference with everyone else until the bowls. Though I will say personal belief is I think there was a little more flukiness than people want to give it credit for.
Josh, what you just said seems to be something similar to what I point out to people all the time that call me and start to try to rank conferences and change those rankings and ratings and evaluations once they start to go into their silos to play only conference games. And it's like, okay, I understand the narrative may be different when Clemson declines, that's not a good national look because people don't expect Duke to take their place. But if you're evaluating the conference top to bottom, the only way you can do that is by non-conference results. They all play 500 football against each other. So if you're truly ranking the conference 1 to 14 or 1 to 12, then that's evaluation. Now, obviously, the distribution of the strength within the conference can be debated and what that looks like, and if that's good for the conference in competing, in major bowls or for a college football playoff.
Yeah, and I'll tack on to that quickly. I mean, this has been a soapbox for me for 5+ years. I used to call it the bag of wins concept, that every conference has a fixed bag of wins. Everybody's going to go 500, but you know exactly how many wins and how many losses the conference is going to have at conference play, week 1 starting conference play. It's fixed, right? And whether all those wins get drawn out by Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State, or whether they get drawn evenly around the conference only reflects how even or uneven that conference is relative to itself. It doesn't reflect overall quality. And it does drive me nuts when we start to say this conference that has two undefeated teams or two undefeated teams and two 10-win teams is better than another conference as a result of that. No, it just means that they're more uneven. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily, a team that's dominating the conference might dominate another conference if the conferences were equal, but it really doesn't inform of that. Your eye test does, and out of conference play does. And to that point, I think one of the problems with current narratives relative to the SEC, I do believe the SEC's down. Let me be clear. But saying it's down because, for example, LSU lost to Florida State in a game where it looked like they were going to blow out Florida State for a half and then quit in the second half, that loses a little bit of importance now that LSU's lost to Ole Miss, right? They're not the dominant SEC West favorite that they got hyped to be. We ignore the second half of that. They didn't lose to Ole Miss because they lost to Florida State. They lost to Ole Miss because the defense is bad, and they lost to Florida State because the defense is bad, and they almost lost to Arkansas. So at some point, our perceptions, like Florida with Utah, I think Florida is going to struggle to make a bowl in the SEC. I think there were some perceptions we had about where teams were to start the season that informed a lot of our views on non-conference play. And the one thing I'll push back on when you look at conference play is just to reevaluate, okay, did Florida State beating LSU mean what we think it means? And right now, I don't know that Florida State is head and shoulders better than the rest of the ACC. So that's kind of a good thing for Duke and Clemson and whatnot. But at the same token, I don't think that LSU is the class of the SEC. And it, to me, it results in one of the more muddled years of college football we've had in a long time.
Yeah, a couple points off of that I've just kind of observed from watching everybody else's feedback and responses is, number one, that people love offense. So if Nebraska goes to Minnesota in week 1 and they lose 45-42, then people are like, wow, they barely lost. That was a good effort. That was a really good game. And they were impressed with that. Nebraska loses 13-10. It's awful. They're trash, and maybe they are. That's obviously beside the point, but just people are in love with offense. Therefore, they mistake value and credibility for just excitement. They're excited that watching high scoring football games, but that doesn't mean the teams are good. That would be number one. And the other point to your distribution of strength within the conferences, it appears as though when one team is dominant, like Clemson has been in the ACC 2015 through 20, in particular, that's a bad look for a conference. When one team reigns over the rest of the conference, that's a bad look. And then the other bad look is when everyone cannibalizes each other and everybody's 8-4 near the top, 9-3. And that doesn't look good because you do not have a clear-cut contender for the championship, the national championship. The good look is when you've got a couple teams up at the top, similar to what the Big Ten is showing us right now, that people are impressed with, like 2 or 3 11, 10-win teams that look to be extremely strong, and then they ignore the rest of the conference. And that seems to catch people's eyes as that's a good conference.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's true. I sometimes when you have those situations or you got a week, when you have such a weak conference that you've got a Clemson that never plays anyone that really threatens them, that just gets tossed aside. But the moment there's a Clemson and a Florida State, and they both go into some game at the end of the year, 10-0 or something, we tend to say, oh, well, you're an undefeated to beat an undefeated. You must be fantastic. And, it's like, well, those two undefeateds were no better than the team would have. If Florida State didn't exist, Clemson would be the same team. And if you've got two of them and they play each other, this is the thing that always bothers me. One of them has to win. One of them has to lose every time. So like you said, I think that kind of naturally creates this world where you've got 2 or 3 of them. If you got 3 teams in that top tier, naturally there's a good chance one of them is going to go either 2-0 or obviously one of them is going to go at least 1-1. And so you end up with a 1-loss team out of that or an undefeated team out of that set of 3. And then we just perceive that as better when the reality is it just, maybe it has to do with more with how weak the rest of the conference is. And again, when you just have 3 teams left at the end, somebody's going to come out of that 2-0, or again, mathematically must come out no worse than 1-1. So, or it's kind of weird how we perceive these things for sure in college football.
I love what you said several minutes ago about uh, attempting to build a model that's going to rank all the teams 1 through 133, because that's what I would like to do. If I had the time to do it, I would rank all the teams, because there's nothing magical about 25 teams. It's just a random number. And as I was trying to point out to our audience the other day and showing the other votes in the AP poll, which I don't look at the AP poll on a regular basis, but those teams are ranked as well. It's the same process of receiving votes for those teams. They just decided not to put a number next to their name and put them on the list. The 26th rated team in the country, according to the AP poll this week, is actually closer to number 25 than 25 is to 24 by a large degree. So they just decide to stop the list at 25. And this whole they're ranked, they're not ranked really doesn't hold a lot of water with me.
Yeah, and everybody knows it, but the AP poll definitely gets some things wrong. Having Tennessee ahead of Florida repeatedly didn't make a lot of sense the way the season's gone. And that's one where, again, you say a lot of points, right? Tennessee blew out Virginia in an out of conference game that I think, especially early in the year, a lot of those games get hyped. Truly, they do get hyped because of media interest. They want people to watch the games. Virginia is a horrible football team, as we now know. So there's actually not much reason to think Tennessee's particularly good at all at right now. I mean, they beat South Carolina, but I also think South Carolina is a bad football team. So yeah, I don't know. The good thing is that the AP poll doesn't carry that much weight. I do chuckle when people say they want to go back to the BCS where you combine the coaches and the AP. I don't think the playoff committee is perfect, and I'm curious if you agree with me on this, Mark. I do feel like if you actually look and break down the playoff committee rankings, I have never seen their ranking worse than the AP poll. I have pretty consistently found whatever I thought it should be, and a couple times in recent years it hasn't been great. The committee said turnover. They were much better early on, but it's still pretty consistently better than the AP and coaches poll, in my opinion.
Josh, not to tell a long story here, but just to give some context to this, I go back to my days when I covered the SEC as a TV broadcaster and was going to the games and so forth, the locker rooms, the press conferences, all of it. And then these AP writers would be there. Well, on your typical SEC football day or anywhere in college football, if you're showing up for a 3:30 game, you're showing up at noon. You may have to travel 2 hours. You're basically missing the day in college football. By the time you watch this 4-hour game, stay for the coaches' news conferences, go to the locker rooms, write your stories, put together your broadcast, whatever you're doing, you've exhausted the day focused on your team, and you don't know what's going on elsewhere in college football. Now, in today's age, obviously, you can keep up much better than you could at one point, but I don't fault those AP voters for being hyper focused on their teams and the teams that their teams play. However, they have a job to do, and that's to know every tiny injury and backup battle at left guard and all the intricacies of their team. It's not to know the landscape of college football. Therefore, they do a poor job of voting across the landscape of college football, and that's just the way it is. Um, and so that's one issue. Yes, the college football playoff committee, and maybe some people that'll watch this, that watch me on a regular basis, may get this confused because I have an issue with there being 4 teams selected and not every conference being included. That has nothing to do with how well the committee does. I think the committee's done a fine job. I just don't like the format itself, and that's where I draw the line.
Yeah, the one anecdote I'll say this year is Washington at 7. If you've really watched all the teams play, there is no reason Washington should be all the way down at 7. There's just not. It's just where they were ranked in people's minds going into it, and maybe that falls down later. But that they've been probably by far the most dominant team in college football this year. But if they're in the West Coast, they've played a lot of their games really late at night, and quite frankly, I imagine a lot of AP voters have never really laid eyes on. And yeah, no, I'm with you. it's a moot point, but it always cracks me up. People want to go back to the BCS because what they're really talking about is they don't like the format. But if you're talking about the selection criteria, man, the way they rank the teams 1 through 25 in the playoff committee probably has been the best of any system we've currently used in terms of outcome, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Not
I would
perfect, but
completely
it's been
agree.
better.
Yes, I would completely agree. And one more anecdote would be 2004. USC and Oklahoma started 1-2. Auburn started at 19 in the AP poll. And obviously, they hit a ceiling. All three teams went undefeated. Auburn wasn't going to crack the top two because they started at 19. And I think the voters have become a little more sophisticated than that, but there's still a number of voters that basically, when you mark your territory, it's marked, and you can string up a bunch of bad performances, and the team three spots behind you could just have just rolled off some nice wins against better competition, and it just doesn't matter. They've staked their claim in their territory, and that's the way they vote.
Yeah,
So,
no. Unfortunately, that's the way it is.
Josh, College Football Nerds, it's a great place to be. collegefootballnerds.com as well. And of course, there's shows right here on YouTube. One last thing, Josh, before I let you go, I could talk ball, obviously, with you all day, would be any bizarre results out there or underachieving teams that really caught you by surprise, or overachieving teams? What's really stood out to you from a uh, bizarre standpoint through 5 weeks?
That's a fairly interesting question. I've already mentioned the Colorado TCU result week 1, which has had everyone so enthralled. That game is still strange to me. TCU was in the 130s in explosive passing plays allowed last year, but they had a good pass rush. So a lot of times passes, those are the weird stats you see sometimes, right? Because we talk about the Milrow thing. Jalen Milrow is number 1 in ESPN's QBR for last week. And there's two problems with that. One, ESPN's QBR, which is a proprietary statistic, that is not QB rating, and people don't always understand that. It's about half run and half pass, which is why he's so high. This happens constantly with running QBs. They end up stupid high in that ranking. He's not a top 15 guy in their pass metrics. But the second part is it doesn't. All these metrics don't take into account all the plays where he doesn't throw the ball because of how we do stats in college football, right? You take a sack, you run out of bounds on a pass play, and we say it looks like you threw 12 pass attempts when you they called something like 20, 25 pass plays, normal game. I think TCU was a lot worse than we anticipated. And that kind of got across the fact that without their pass rushers from last year, TCU suddenly became kind of impotent because that secondary that was being kind of hidden as a bad secondary is being exposed. Colorado looked a lot better. I thought the most impressive thing to me was how well they were coached going into that game. That was a prepared team that had a defined scheme, a defined defense. They was a well-coached football team, but they also weren't particularly good on defense. And a lot of what they were doing on offense had a lot to do with what TCU was doing wrong. I still say the goalpost for them is 7-5. And if they hit that mark, Deion did a phenomenal job. The Heisman talk's was always a little crazy and unrealistic for the total top to bottom talent level, or as was playoff talk. So that's the big one that immediately comes to mind. And then, in terms of other results, to me, it's just the nature of this season where, and we talked about this in the preseason on our show, most of the top teams, it was kind of weird, all of them really, they're all replacing their left tackle and their starting quarterback. And everybody talked about the quarterbacks. Not many people noticed that Ohio State, Georgia, and Alabama were also losing their tackles. That's a rough combo. And I think that more than anything has created, what we actually said in the preseason looked like the most ripe year to be that 2007 zany year in a long time. Because if you don't have consistent quarterback play and you're taking pressure, suddenly you can't score 40 plus. I mean, in college football these days, if you're an elite offense, you can put 40 plus up on virtually anyone because the rules are broken in favor of the offense. The RPO makes it impossible to key run pass anymore. But no one's at that level. Georgia's kind of taken advantage of it the past few years, but they were this efficiency monster under Stetson Bennett with Monken, and that's gone. So it's hard to really say anything particular that's been particularly odd out of context beyond that. And I think we're still going to learn more because our model is, I'm telling you right now, Kentucky in our model is actually fourth. Miami's fifth, Washington's sixth in overall quality. And maybe Kentucky is a mirage, but it's convinced that Kentucky is this latent juggernaut. It'll be curious if Georgia knocks them down. And again, trend indicator, not a score predictor. But it's just not what I think people expected to see, more than it is that college football is down. And it takes a while for people to adjust to, yeah, like you said, maybe Clemson's not great, but maybe Duke is really good. People just see Clemson not being as good and then say everybody's down. They don't notice the other team being better.
Yeah, the factor in the QBR, and you can probably bring better light to this, that I really think has just been valid in all of that, is that if you complete a 3-yard pass, the passer rating just equates that exactly the same, regardless of the situation. But it's the situation part of it that has been brought to the QBR. If you're throwing a 3-yard touchdown pass that wins the game, that's completely treated differently than a 3-yard completion on 3rd and 17 that accomplished nothing. And it's also that situational aspect of the QBR that's certainly blown away the passer rating.
Yeah, so and that is interesting, and that brings in a concept called EPA, or estimated points added. I feel like I always need to give a shout out to Parker Fleming that we interact with some on Twitter, because he had a big hand in bringing that to the college scene. And there's sort of an underlying concept that yardage at different points in the field and in different situations has different values. And the big thing that QBR brings to play is it brings a lot of components in for a passing EPA, a rushing EPA, weights against opponents, and weights against frequency. My complaint with QBR is, while it does that and EPA is good, they don't disclose how they mix those variables, and it's really clear that they overemphasize rushing. The final result usually ends up being pretty good, because passing usually ends up, at the end of the day and the end of the season, winning out. And if you look at just compare passer to passer, it's good, but they've got some balance issues, specifically with how ESPN QBR uses the components. But that EPA concept, from a modeling perspective, and if you want to compile an advanced stats, actually really, really strong. Because like you're saying, yardage doesn't mean the same thing. If you're 3rd and 1 and you throw a 3-yard pass, that's a success. If you're 1st and 10 and you throw a 3-yard pass, that's a failure. And teams are intentionally choosing which they do in which situation, and you need to be aware of that. Completing an 8-yard completion on the 8-yard line is obviously not the same as your own 20-yard line. And so I do think that EPA component to QBR is a good thing. And I think EPA from a modeling perspective is great. I will say we don't use or cite EPA too much, because it's a very hard metric to state and have anyone understand what you mean. It's like saying you have an EPA of 2.3. What does that mean? And even I can't necessarily tell you offhand what a given EPA means. But the usage of those kinds of relative situational statistics does end up generating much better advanced stats more often than not.
And to your earlier point about Colorado, I gave all sorts of credit to Deion Sanders, because I got to say, after watching them play TCU, it wasn't the speed in space. It wasn't even necessarily Sean Lewis's creativity as a play caller, because I anticipated that and a lot of the flashy, fun things in that game. It was that 68 transfer players, 20 true freshmen, threw together 88 players in the last 6 weeks, and they're not committing penalties, false starts. They're not blowing coverages. Sure, the defense isn't good, but it's in position. They seem to know what they're doing. They're really buttoned up for a week 1 performance. And then the other thing, Josh, would be that these last 2 outings against Oregon and USC have kind of played out the way I expected. Not exactly when I expected, but that once I got a handle on who Colorado was, I thought, once they play the best teams in the Pac-12, when they're on their game, they're going to scare the hell out of some teams. But when they're not on their game, it can get really ugly, because they're a pitch and catch team. And if they don't have it that day and can't block people or scheme it right, then yeah, it could get ugly, like it did obviously at Oregon.
Yeah, and I'll give one last pitch for stuff that we do, which is we have a statistic called relative performance. So it's something we've played with off and on in our model. Basically, we're taking your opponent averages, and we're saying, how did your opponent do against everyone else they played, and how did you do against your opponent? in isolation compared to those other games, and were you better or worse than your opponent? I'm a big believer in citing statistics that are somewhat relatively easy to understand. So it comes out as a percentage, right? Like you were 24% better yard per carry versus everybody else that played your schedule. And we're kind of hybridizing it, right? Looking at each team and looking at everyone they played and how you did in that game and the next game, et cetera, et cetera. And Colorado in that regard does do pretty well. And I'm going to try to do this on the fly, which is always a dangerous thing. But if you look at Colorado statistically, they're like passing yards per game in that relative statistic, they're eighth. Passing yards per attempt, they're actually 18th. That's really impressive. They're 45th in yards per attempt, but they've actually played some pretty good defenses, as you noted. And defensively, they're in the hundreds in most absolute statistics. But if you look at this relative statistic relative to who they played, given they played Oregon, given they played USC, they're generally somewhere between 40th and 70th. And that's, for a P5 team, that's bad, but that's not atrocious. And defense is all about continuity. As you said, it's a totally rebuilt defense. Maybe I'm a little partial. A little brother of a friend of mine is actually playing for them. They're a competent defensive unit, and they're a very competent offensive unit, and they've got some good skill players. And if they can leverage them in a game, great. And if they can't, like you said, it's going to fall apart. But it is interesting to say that I think it's impressive that Dion built a very competent team. Again, probably a team that's going to go something like 7-5, but to take 80 kids 6 weeks before the season and have anything but a 2-10 team, no matter the talent level, is impressive. So you got to give them a lot of credit for that.
No doubt. Great stuff from Josh at College Football Nerds. And again, head on over there, check out what they've got going right here on YouTube. And you see the URL that's easy to find, collegefootballnerds.com.